My name is Morgan. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, not loud, not flashy, the one who shows up early, leaves notes that actually make sense, and remembers details others forget. If you've worked in an office, you've met someone like me, or maybe you are someone like me. People tend to underestimate that kind of presence. They assume calm means passive, that competence without self-promotion means replaceable. That if you don't narrate your own value out loud, someone else will decide what you're worth and when you're done. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about winning an argument in a meeting or exposing anyone in a dramatic way. It's about something quieter than that. It's about how a series of very small decisions made by other people and then by me slowly reshaped the balance of power in a room where no one thought power was shifting at all. For 6 months, I trained my replacement. I didn't know that's what I was doing at first. I thought I was being helpful, responsible, a team player. HR later called what happened restructuring. My calendar told a different story, one made up of invites, deadlines, and patterns that only become obvious when you stop explaining them away. What you're going to hear is a first-person account of how that realization unfolded, not all at once, not with a dramatic soundtrack, but gradually in the way real understanding usually arrives, quietly and a little too late. This is a story about invisibility at work and what happens when someone mistakes your silence for consent. It's about being useful until you're inconvenient, trusted until you're expendable. And it's about what it means to choose restraint, not because you're afraid, but because you're paying attention. I won't name companies or villains. There are no cartoon antagonists here, just ordinary people making ordinary decisions that felt harmless to them at the time. I'll tell you what I saw, what I felt, and what I did, without exaggeration, without theatrics, and without asking you to take sides. If there's any promise I'm making at the start of this, it's honesty. Not drama, not revenge fantasies, just a clear-eyed walk through an experience that changed how I understand loyalty, leverage, and self-respect. As you listen, you might recognize moments that feel uncomfortably familiar. You might remember meetings you stayed quiet in or extra responsibilities you accepted without question. If that happens, I want you to sit with that feeling, not to judge yourself, but to notice it. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without pressure. Have you ever looked back at a professional moment and realized you understood its meaning only after it was already over? For a long time, I was the person people went to when they wanted something done, not when they wanted to decide something. That distinction matters more than it sounds. On paper, my role looked solid, senior enough to be trusted, not senior enough to be threatening. I was looped into projects early, often before they had a name. I was the one who translated vague ideas into timelines, who noticed when dependencies didn't line up, who quietly fixed gaps before they turned into visible problems. When something went smoothly, no one asked how. When something broke, someone inevitably said, "Morgan will know." I didn't mind that at first. There's a certain satisfaction in being reliable, being the calm presence when others panic. I liked that people felt steadier when I was in the room, even if they rarely said it out loud. My performance reviews reflected this in a familiar way. Exceptionally dependable, strong execution, and great support to leadership. The language was warm but strangely hollow. It praised outcomes without ever mentioning influence. To them, I was infrastructure. Important, yes, but background. Like electricity, you only notice it when it's gone. In meetings, I was often the one taking notes, even when the meeting wasn't mine. I'd ask clarifying questions that helped everyone else sound smarter 5 minutes later. I'd flag risks gently, phrasing them as curiosities so no one felt challenged. People nodded, typed, and moved on. Later, when the risk materialized, someone would say, "I think Morgan mentioned this." I was mentioned, rarely quoted. No one was cruel, that's important to say, There were no raised voices, no public dismissals, just a consistent pattern of being useful without being central, trusted without being consulted. I was the person you CC'd after decisions were made, so I could help operationalize. I told myself that was fine. I told myself influence didn't need a spotlight. That impact was enough. If I kept doing excellent work, recognition would follow naturally. That belief felt mature, professional, almost virtuous. What I didn't realize was that I was training people how to see me. When new hires joined, I onboarded them. Not officially, just naturally. I explained how things actually worked, not how the slide decks described them. I shared templates I'd built over the years, frameworks refined through quiet trial and error. People appreciated it, managers loved it. "You're so generous with your knowledge," one said once, smiling like it was a compliment without consequence. Generous is a word people use when they assume there's plenty more where that came from. Over time, I became associated with continuity rather than growth, stability rather than vision. If something needed rethinking, someone else was invited. If something needed maintaining, I was assigned. I didn't protest. I didn't correct the framing. Part of me believed this was temporary. Another part believed that pushing for visibility would cheapen the work itself. So I stayed composed. I stayed helpful. I stayed quiet. And because I stayed quiet, people filled in the silence with their own assumptions. They assumed I was content, that I wasn't ambitious, that I preferred support over leadership, that I would always be there, smoothing edges, absorbing overflow, adapting without complaint. They never asked if those assumptions were true, and I never corrected them. From the outside, I imagine I looked settled, reliable, slightly invisible in a way that felt safe to everyone else. I was the kind of employee managers sleep well knowing they have. What no one saw, not even me at first, was that invisibility isn't neutral. It shapes how decisions are made around you. It determines whose absence would be felt and whose would be explained away. At that stage, I still believed my value was obvious, that it spoke for itself. I hadn't yet learned that when you don't define your role, someone else eventually will. The first moment that stayed with me didn't announce itself as important. It wasn't dramatic, no sharp words, no confrontation. In fact, it was so minor that I almost forgot it, except that something in me quietly refused to let it go. We were in a recurring planning meeting, the kind that existed mostly to create the illusion of alignment. I had spent the previous week mapping out a dependency issue that wasn't obvious on the surface but would absolutely matter 2 months down the line. I didn't send a long email about it. I brought it up briefly, calmly, with options. Not alarms. There was a pause, a few nods. Then the director facilitating the meeting said, "Okay, let's keep moving," and clicked to the next slide. 10 minutes later, someone else raised the same concern, nearly word for word. This time, the response was different. "That's a great catch," the director said. "We should definitely plan for that." People leaned in, notes were taken, action items were assigned. No one acknowledged the repetition. Not out of malice, out of momentum. Meetings move fast, and credit is an inconvenience. I told myself that was all it was. But I remember the feeling. Not anger, not embarrassment, something colder, like watching a door close softly without sound. After the meeting, a colleague messaged me privately. "Hey, didn't you say that earlier?" There was a laughing emoji at the end, like we were sharing an inside joke. I replied with something neutral. I don't remember the exact words, only that they were designed to smooth, not sharpen. I didn't want to be that person, the one who tracks credit, the one who makes things awkward. That's how small cuts work. They rely on your cooperation. Over the next few weeks, variations of that moment repeated themselves. Ideas floated past me, resurfaced later with different names attached. Decisions that leaned heavily on my analysis were framed as group conclusions. I was still invited to the table, but increasingly after the meal had been planned. I noticed, but I didn't react. Instead, I rationalized. I told myself this was normal, that visibility ebbs and flows, that maybe I hadn't spoken loudly enough or confidently enough. I replayed meetings in my head, adjusting my tone in hindsight, as if this were a performance issue I could fix with better delivery. So I tried small adjustments. I spoke earlier. I used firmer language. I summarized my points at the end instead of the middle. It didn't change much. What changed slowly was how I was positioned. A new initiative was launched, and I was asked to support it, not lead, support. That word again. I was assigned to onboard a new hire who would own a portion of my existing scope, framed as workload relief, as an investment, as growth. Think of this as mentorship, my manager said. You're great at bringing people up to speed. I smiled, I agreed, I meant it. But that night, when I looked at my calendar and saw how my responsibilities were being redistributed, not reduced, just reframed, something tightened in my chest. I couldn't have named it then, only that the pattern felt familiar now, like a shape I'd seen before but hadn't wanted to trace. The first small cut doesn't hurt because it's deep. It hurts because it introduces the idea that you can be diminished quietly, while everyone insists nothing has changed. And because at that point you still believe the benefit of the doubt will protect you. I did, for a while longer. Once you explain something away enough times, it starts to feel like the truth. That's what happened next. The small cuts didn't stop. They simply became routine, predictable enough that I began to account for them in advance. I'd walk into meetings already adjusting my expectations. If I had an idea, I'd decide whether it was worth spending political capital on. If I anticipated resistance, I'd soften it before anyone else could. I learned to translate my own thinking into language that felt safe for the room. And when that didn't work, I told myself it wasn't personal. Disrespect rarely arrives wearing a name tag. It disguises itself as oversight, as urgency, as will circle back. It hides behind good intentions and busy calendars. The danger is that over time you start collaborating with it. A clear example, my role was gradually redefined without conversation. Projects I used to own outright now had stakeholders inserted above me. Not because I'd failed, my metrics were strong, but because someone else wanted visibility. I'd be asked to prepare detailed briefs only to be excluded from the meeting where those briefs were discussed. Decisions would come back downstream already made with notes attached like instructions. Can you just implement this? Just. I noticed how often that word appeared in messages addressed to me. I also noticed how rarely my manager asked for my opinion before agreeing to something on my behalf. He wasn't unkind. He simply assumed I'd adapt. And I always did, on time, without complaint. That became the expectation. There was a moment, small, again, when a colleague interrupted me mid-sentence in a meeting, not aggressively, casually. He finished my thought, but in a way that stripped out the nuance I was trying to add. The room followed him. I stopped speaking. Later, someone said, "You're so patient. I don't know how you stay so calm." It was meant as admiration. I smiled. I said nothing. Inside, I told myself patience was a strength, that not needing the floor meant I was secure, that real power didn't need to announce itself. All of that was true in theory. But theory doesn't protect you when other people are quietly rewriting your value. What made it harder was that nothing was egregious enough to call out cleanly. There was no single incident I could point to without sounding sensitive. Each moment on its own was defensible. Collectively, they formed a pattern I didn't yet feel entitled to name, so I didn't. Instead, I normalized it. I adjusted my standards. I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I stopped assuming inclusion. I started thinking of myself as the person behind the scenes. Not because that's what I wanted, but because that's where I was being placed. And here's the uncomfortable truth. I helped make it seamless. I filled gaps without being asked. I corrected mistakes quietly. I stayed late to ensure launches succeeded, even when I wasn't credited. I told myself this was professionalism, that outcomes mattered more than optics. But optics decide outcomes long before you see the results. The more I absorbed, the more invisible I became. The more invisible I became, the easier it was for others to overlook me. It was a closed loop, and I was maintaining it myself. At home, I felt oddly tired. Not burned out, something subtler, like I was carrying a weight that wasn't heavy enough to complain about, but too heavy to ignore. I stopped talking about work with friends. There was nothing wrong, exactly, just nothing right enough to explain. Looking back, this was a stage where I still believed endurance was a virtue in itself, that if I stayed steady long enough, things would rebalance. I hadn't yet accepted that what you tolerate becomes the blueprint for how you're treated, and that once a system adjusts to your silence, it resists your voice. It didn't happen in a meeting. It happened in the way people spoke around me. I started to notice that when new projects were discussed, my name appeared in a very specific context, not as the person who would shape direction, but as the one who would make sure it runs smoothly. I was looped in after excitement had already peaked, once the messy work needed to be contained. I had become the stabilizer, reliable, useful, invisible. No one said this outright. Roles like mine are rarely declared. They're inferred, assigned through repetition, reinforced through tone, through who gets asked the first question and who gets asked the last. When a senior leader joined a meeting, eyes shifted upward, not toward me. Even when the subject was something I'd built from the ground up, someone else did the talking. I filled in details when prompted, like footnotes spoken aloud. At some point, I realized people were more comfortable with me supporting than leading. My calm made them feel safe. My restraint made them feel unchallenged. I didn't disrupt hierarchies, I lubricated them. And that made me valuable in a very specific, limited way. The clearest example came when a new hire was officially assigned to partner with me. On paper, it was a collaboration. In practice, it was succession. He was smart, eager, and clearly being positioned for visibility. I was asked to walk him through systems, stakeholders, historical context. Not just the what, but the why, the kind of knowledge that takes years to accumulate. "You're the best person for this," my manager said. "You know how everything connects." I did, and I shared it. I told myself this was leadership, that lifting someone else didn't diminish me, that organizations reward those who build others. But there was an asymmetry I couldn't ignore anymore. He was introduced in meetings with future-oriented language, growth potential, fresh perspective. I was introduced, if at all, as support, as continuity, as someone who will help ensure success. Ensuring success is not the same as being seen as the reason for it. The role I was being assigned wasn't malicious, it was convenient. I had become the person who absorbed complexity so others could shine, the one who made transitions seamless, the one who ensured nothing broke during the change. And because I was good at it, no one questioned whether I wanted to keep doing it. I started to see how the narrative worked. I wasn't framed as someone with upward momentum, I was framed as someone who held things together. And once that label sticks, it's hard to escape without disruption. The unsettling part was realizing how much of this had been shaped by my own behavior. I had never said, "I want to lead this." I had never corrected assumptions. I had equated humility with invisibility and consistency with consent. So the role solidified. I was the bridge, the buffer, the fallback plan, not the future. And once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Because roles like this don't come with a ceiling. You don't get told when you've reached it. You just stop being considered for anything beyond it. Quietly, logically, as if it were always obvious. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't about a single person undervaluing me. It was about a system that had learned how to use me efficiently. And systems don't change unless something forces them to. At that point, I still hadn't decided to be that force, but something had shifted. I was no longer confused. The shift didn't arrive with clarity. It arrived as a pause. I was sitting at my desk, early morning, before the office filled in. My calendar was open, not because I needed to check my day, but because I was staring at it without really seeing it. a habit I'd picked up without noticing, scanning for pressure points, for where I was needed, for where I would be useful. That morning, something felt off, not urgent, not alarming, just still. I noticed how full my calendar was with meetings I didn't own, check-ins, syncs, reviews, conversations where my role was to enable, clarify, and translate. Very few blocks where I was shaping direction, almost none where I was making decisions. It wasn't new, but it was newly visible. I scrolled back 6 months, then a year. The pattern was undeniable. As my calendar filled, my influence narrowed. I was busy in a way that felt productive but wasn't expansive. Movement without momentum. And for the first time, I didn't rush to explain it away. Later that day, I was asked, casually, to update a process document, something I'd originally built, refined, and maintained. The request itself wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was who it was for. The new hire, the one I'd been mentoring. "Can you make it more step by step?" my manager said, "so it's easier to hand off." Hand off. The words landed differently than they would have a week earlier, not as a threat, as information. I nodded. I said yes. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, something went quiet. There was no anger, no spike of emotion, just a subtle withdrawal. Like a door closing gently, not to keep anyone out, but to keep something in. That night, I didn't vent to a friend. I didn't replay conversations. I didn't draft imaginary emails. I did something I hadn't done in months. I sat with the discomfort without narrating it. And in that silence, a question surfaced. Not loud, not accusatory. What if I stopped assuming this would resolve itself? That question didn't demand an answer. It simply existed. Over the next few days, I noticed I was listening differently. Not just to what people said, but to what they assumed. To what they didn't bother to explain because they believed I'd comply. I heard certainty in voices that used to sound collaborative. "You'll take care of this." "Can you just, we'll need you to?" No discussion, no framing, just expectation. And I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't hurt. I was clear. Clarity changes the texture of everything. Once you see a pattern for what it is, it stops feeling personal. It stops triggering defensiveness. It becomes data. That's what this moment was, data. I began to understand that my silence up to this point hadn't been neutral. It had been interpreted as an agreement, as availability, as permanence. And permanence is dangerous in systems that reward novelty and visibility. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't pull my manager aside. I didn't adjust my tone in meetings. I kept doing my work. I stayed composed. But the shift had already happened. I stopped performing loyalty without reflection. I stopped offering more than was asked. I stopped cushioning other people's decisions. Not out of spite, out of awareness. This wasn't the day I decided to leave. It wasn't even the day I decided to protect myself. It was the day I stopped assuming that patience on its own would change my trajectory. And once that assumption fell away, everything else became possible. There's a difference between being quiet because you don't feel safe speaking and being quiet because you're observing. My silence shifted from habit to intention. Outwardly, nothing looked different. I still attended the same meetings. I still delivered on deadlines. I still answered questions with clarity and calm, but internally, I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to carry. I stopped preemptively solving problems no one had acknowledged yet. And people noticed, just not in the way you'd expect. They assumed I was tired, or busy, or temporarily disengaged. One colleague asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said yes. It was true. Everything was okay. For the first time in a while, I wasn't overextending myself to maintain an image that benefited everyone but me. What changed most was how I listened. I paid attention to what happened when I didn't volunteer context, when I didn't summarize, when I didn't quietly steer conversations back on track. Meetings ran longer, decisions became fuzzier, follow-ups increased. No one connected that shift to me. That was the moment I understood how deeply embedded I'd been. My silence wasn't read as a strategy. It was read as an absence, and absence, in their minds, confirmed the role they'd assigned me. Supportive, not central. Helpful, not critical. That misinterpretation gave me room. I began documenting things, methodically, without emotion. Processes I'd built, decisions I'd influenced but never been credited for, dependencies that lived only in my head. I didn't do this with the intent to weaponize it. I did it because I needed to see the full shape of my contribution, outside of anyone else's narrative. What surprised me was the scope. There were systems no one else fully understood, relationships that functioned because I translated between personalities, knowledge that existed nowhere except in conversations I'd had, problems I'd solved quietly, patterns I'd learned over time. I had thought of this as shared knowledge. It wasn't. It was mine. And yet, I didn't announce this realization. I didn't hint at it. I didn't test it by withholding information dramatically. I continued to do my job, just not extra jobs I'd been absorbing without acknowledgement. Silence, used this way, is a mirror. It shows people the shape of what they've been leaning on without naming it. Some responded by stepping up. Others grow frustrated. A few by becoming oddly deferential, as if sensing a shift they couldn't articulate. No one asked directly, and I didn't offer explanations. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about recalibrating my relationship to my own energy, about choosing when to engage and when to let systems reveal themselves. I also began to notice something else. The new hire, the one I'd been mentoring, was now being positioned more prominently. I wasn't. I used to answer. He'd reach out to me afterward, confused, needing context. I gave it, calmly, completely. Because clarity at this stage wasn't about withholding. It was about timing. I wasn't angry at him. He was doing what he'd been encouraged to do. The issue wasn't personal. It was structural. And I was finally seeing the structure clearly. Silence had given me that vantage point. Not the silence of resignation. The silence of someone who is no longer trying to be misunderstood less and is instead trying to understand more. What they never noticed was how much of the organization lived in the spaces between roles. Not in org charts, not in job descriptions, in the transitions, the handoffs, the moments where something almost failed but didn't because someone intervened quietly. That someone had often been me. As I pulled back just enough to see the system, instead of propping it up, I began to map it. Not emotionally, but practically. I kept my black leather notebook close, not out of secrecy, out of precision. I documented how projects actually moved, not how they were described. Who approved things in theory versus who actually made them happen. Where information is bottlenecked. Which relationships smoothed friction and which created it. I noted timelines that only worked because I anticipated delays before anyone admitted they existed. None of this raised alarms. Why would it? From the outside, I was still compliant, still helpful, still calm. I hadn't changed my tone or my output enough to trigger concern. I simply stopped compensating invisibly. The preparation wasn't dramatic, it was patient. I refined documentation in ways that looked like good governance. I cleaned up shared drives. I centralized files that had been scattered across inboxes and personal folders. I standardized templates. I clarified ownership in places where ambiguity had protected inefficiency. No one objected. In fact, people thanked me. "You're so organized. This is really helpful. We should have done this sooner." They didn't ask why I was doing it now. At the same time, I observed how the new hire navigated his growing visibility. He wasn't careless. He was earnest. But he didn't see what I saw yet, the history beneath the surface. He relied on the systems I'd built without realizing how provisional they were. He assumed stability where there was memory. And memory is fragile when it isn't shared deliberately. I continued mentoring him. Not less. Not differently. I answered his questions, I explained the decisions, I even flagged risks, though now I did so in writing, with dates and context, not as warnings, as records. That distinction mattered. What they also never noticed was how often decisions were being made without full information because they assumed someone else had it covered. They assumed I would step in if something was off, and I still did when it crossed into harm. My moral code hadn't changed. I wasn't interested in watching things fail to make a point, but I stopped shielding people from the natural consequences of their own assumptions. That's a subtle line, one you don't cross loudly. I also started having quiet conversations outside the building, not about grievances, about options. I updated my resume, not in a rush, not as an escape plan, as a reality check. I spoke to a former colleague about consulting. I asked a lawyer friend general questions about severance norms just to understand the landscape. Information is not intent, at least not yet. What struck me most during this phase was how calm I felt. Not empowered in a dramatic sense, grounded, like I was finally standing on something solid, my own awareness. They never noticed the shift because it didn't threaten them. I wasn't asking for more. I wasn't pushing back. I wasn't signaling dissatisfaction. I was simply no longer assuming alignment where none had been confirmed. And that kind of preparation is invisible to people who believe the ground beneath them is fixed. It isn't. It's maintained, often by someone they don't think to watch. The reveal didn't come from a conversation. It came from a document. I was reviewing a shared planning file late one evening, the kind that gets passed around without much scrutiny because it looks administrative. I'd been added to it automatically, one of many recipients. Out of habit, I scrolled past the top and landed on a tab that hadn't been mentioned. Headcount assumptions. I shouldn't have been surprised that it existed. What surprised me was how explicit it was. There were names, dates, transitions mapped cleanly across quarters. And there, in a neutral font, was my role. Redefined, not eliminated yet, phased. Next to it, the new hire's name appeared with expanded scope. A note in the margin read, "Knowledge transfer in progress." I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was absorbing how quietly the decision had been made. No performance issue, no warning, no conversation, just a plan. HR would later call it restructuring. In that moment, it looked like scheduling. What I felt wasn't betrayal, it was confirmation. This was why no one had corrected the imbalance. Why did my manager avoid long-term conversations about growth? Why has my calendar been filling with handoff-adjacent work? The future had already been drafted. I was just executing my part in it, and suddenly the leverage I'd been documenting snapped into focus. It wasn't explosive leverage, not a secret scandal or a smoking gun. It was structural, boring even. The kind that doesn't look like power until you understand how systems function. There were dependencies that no one else fully owned yet. External partners who contacted me directly because I'd been their point of continuity. Regulatory nuances that lived in my notes, not in official documentation. Timelines that worked only because I anticipated friction before it showed up on dashboards. They were counting on a smooth transition. Smooth transitions require consent. I closed the file. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't forward it. I didn't confront anyone the next day. I went home, made dinner, and slept. The clarity was almost relieving. The next morning, I approached my work with the same calm I'd been practicing, but now it had a center. I continued documenting, I continued mentoring, I continued delivering. But internally, the equation had changed. This wasn't about saving my job. It wasn't even about leaving on my terms, though that was becoming an option. It was about not being complicit in my own erasure. For the first time, I considered the idea that restraint could coexist with self-protection, that I didn't need to explode or expose to honor myself. I just needed to stop assuming the plan included me, because it didn't. That private reveal didn't make me reactive. It made me precise. And precision, I was learning, is a form of power that doesn't announce itself. There is a moment when you finally see the full shape of a situation, where action becomes less urgent than alignment. That was where I was. After the private reveal, I didn't feel pressure to move quickly. Speed would have been emotional. I wasn't emotional. I was measured. I had crossed out of reaction and into evaluation, and that space is quieter than people expect. I began listing my options, not in my head, but on paper. I needed to see them outside myself, stripped of pride or fear. The first option was the most obvious: confront my manager. I imagined the conversation easily. I'd reference the document indirectly, ask about my future, express concern about scope changes. The likely outcome played out clearly in my mind, not because I was cynical, but because I understood the incentives. He would be surprised, not by the plan, but by my awareness of it. He'd reassure me. Use language is still valuable, nothing finalized, these things evolve. He might even feel bad, but the plan wouldn't change. At best, it would slow. At worst, I'd be flagged as no longer aligned. Confrontation would make me visible, but not powerful. The second option was to leave immediately. I could start applying aggressively. Signal disengagement, protect my pride by exiting before the end was formalized. People often mistake that for strength. Sometimes it is. But leaving quickly would erase something important: context. It would turn the story into a clean break instead of a complete one. I'd lose leverage I didn't yet fully understand. I'd also be acting from anticipation rather than certainty. I wasn't running from the truth. I was sitting with it. The third option was to stay passive, to continue as I had before, let the transition complete, accept severance, move on quietly. This option tempted me in a dangerous way. It appealed to my discipline, my composure, my ability to endure. But endurance, I was learning, can become a sophisticated form of self-abandonment. If I stayed passive now, knowing what I knew, I would be agreeing, silently, to a version of myself I no longer recognized. That left the fourth option, the irreversible one. Not loud, not aggressive, not illegal or unethical, just final. I could proceed exactly as requested, train my replacement thoroughly, document everything cleanly, ensure continuity, while simultaneously preparing myself for a future that did not include them. And crucially, I could do it without rushing, signaling, or asking permission. This option required the most restraint and the most clarity. It meant accepting that no outcome would restore what I had lost. No apology would rebalance the scales. No late recognition would undo the months of quiet erosion. What it would do is return authorship to me. I would decide when my availability ended. I would decide how my knowledge was transferred and what required relationship, not just documentation. I would decide how much emotional labor I would continue to provide to a system that had already planned my absence. This wasn't revenge. It was boundaries applied retroactively. Once I named that option clearly, I felt the weight of it, because it couldn't be undone. There would be no dramatic turning back, no reveal that forced the company to reevaluate me. That kind of reversal belongs to fiction. This path led forward only. It meant I had to release something subtle but powerful, the hope that someone would notice and intervene. Hope is useful early on, dangerous later. I spent several days not deciding. I wanted to be sure I wasn't acting from wounded pride disguised as principle, so I tested myself. I imagined staying, fully staying, accepting the outcome with grace. Was there relief in that image? No, only resignation. I imagined confronting. Did I feel stronger? No, only exposed. I imagined leaving abruptly. Did that feel clean? No, it felt incomplete. Then I imagined proceeding silently, finishing my work with integrity, preparing my exit with precision, and letting the consequences unfold without commentary. That image didn't excite me. It steadied me. That's how I knew. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by alignment. My actions needed to match my awareness. Anything else would fracture me internally, even if it looked composed from the outside. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sober. Because choosing the irreversible option means giving up the fantasy of being rescued. It means accepting that the story will not end with vindication in the way most people define it. It will end with coherence. From that point forward, I stopped asking myself what they might do. I started asking myself what I would need: 6 months from now to respect how I handled this? That question changed everything. It guided how I documented, how I mentored, how I responded to emails that assumed my future availability, how I interpreted silence from leadership, not as ambiguity, but as confirmation. I didn't rush to cut ties. I didn't withdraw warmth. I didn't burn bridges or drop hints. I simply stopped investing in outcomes that required me to disappear gracefully. I invested instead in optionality, and that more than anything else marked the point of no return. Because once you choose yourself quietly, you don't need anyone else to validate the choice. The system can keep moving. So can you, just not together. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That surprised me. I had expected tension, adrenaline, maybe a constant sense of countdown. Instead, what settled in was a steady, almost meditative focus. When you're no longer negotiating internally, you conserve energy. You stop rehearsing conversations that won't happen. You stop waiting for signals that will never come. I moved carefully, not secretly. There's a difference. Secrecy implies deception. What I was doing required none. Everything I did could withstand daylight. Known but not announced. I continued documenting processes, but I shifted how I documented them. Instead of creating step-by-step instructions that could be followed blindly, I emphasized decision points, context, judgment calls, the places where experience, not procedure, made the difference. On paper, everything looked thorough. In practice, it required someone to think. I organized files cleanly, but I didn't narrate the logic behind their evolution unless asked directly. I answered questions precisely, without adding anticipatory commentary. If someone asked for what, I gave them what. If they asked why, I gave them why. I no longer volunteered the invisible glue. I also began quietly preparing for my own exit, not dramatically, not as an escape, but as a structural reality. I reviewed my financial position, built a buffer, updated benefits documentation. I noted timelines around vesting, bonuses, and severance norms. Not with anxiety, but with the same calm I brought to project planning. This was just another system to understand. I spoke to a lawyer. Not to threaten, not to strategize an attack, but to understand my rights. Knowledge is stabilizing. It keeps fear from filling in gaps. I reached out to 2 former colleagues. Not to complain, to reconnect, to remind myself of how I was seen outside this particular context. Both conversations were grounding. One offered consulting work. I didn't accept immediately. I didn't need to. Optionality grows best when it's not rushed. Inside the office, no one sensed a departure. If anything, they seemed relieved. Things were under control. Transitions were on track. The new hire grew more confident. Leadership leaned back. That was the paradox. The more prepared I became, the less visible the risk appeared to them. Meetings continued. My manager's tone stayed friendly, if slightly distant. We discussed deliverables, not futures. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I stopped interpreting it. One afternoon, I received a meeting invite from HR, 2 weeks out, 30 minutes, no agenda. I accepted it without reaction. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't mark the day mentally as important. I noted it the way you note a deadline you've already planned around. In the days leading up to it, I finished what I'd committed to finish. I closed loops. I left nothing fragile behind. Not out of loyalty, but out of self-respect. I wanted the end of my work to reflect me, not the circumstances. Moving in silence doesn't mean disappearing. It means choosing not to narrate your alignment to people who have already decided how the story ends. And the quiet truth is this: once you stop needing acknowledgement, you become very hard to destabilize. I wasn't waiting for the meeting. The meeting was catching up to me. The first consequence wasn't the meeting. It was the confusion. It showed up in small ways at first. A meeting that ran long because no one summarized the decision. An email thread that looped endlessly because no one clarified ownership. A partner call that felt strangely tense because expectations hadn't been aligned beforehand. None of these things was catastrophic, but they were new. People began asking more questions, not of me, of each other, and the answers were slower, less precise. I watched this happen without satisfaction or concern. Systems adjusting to the absence of invisible labor tend to wobble before they stabilize. What struck me was how quickly discomfort appeared once the buffer was gone. The new hire reached out more frequently now, not with basic questions, but with uncertainty. Do you know why this was set up this way? Has this ever caused issues before? I answered honestly, but narrowly. I pointed him to documents, to threads, to prior decisions. I didn't translate the meaning anymore. That translation had been the unseen work. In meetings, I noticed my manager stepping in where he hadn't before, filling space, making calls with incomplete information. His confidence was intact, but his accuracy suffered. Not dramatically, just enough to create friction downstream. No one blamed him. They couldn't name what was missing. There was a sense of almost aligned, almost clear, almost smooth. People feel lost long before they understand its source. One afternoon, a senior leader asked me a question directly in a meeting. It was technical, layered, the kind of question that used to invite a broader explanation. I answered it simply, correctly. Then I stopped. The pause lingered. "Oh," he said after a moment. "Okay, that was it." Afterward, a colleague messaged me. "Everything good? You seemed quieter." I smiled at the screen, not because the message was ironic, but because it confirmed what I already knew. Quiet looks different when people are used to being carried by it. The most telling shift came in tone. Requests became more tentative. "When you have time. If you could take a look." As if something intangible had changed in the air. It had. I was no longer absorbing uncertainty on their behalf. I wasn't smoothing over ambiguity with confidence. I wasn't pre-solving consequences before they arrived. I wasn't causing the consequences. I was allowing them. And that distinction matters. Nothing broke. Nothing failed publicly. The system simply lost its frictionless quality. The kind of quality people don't notice until it's gone. HR still hadn't reached out beyond the calendar invite. Leadership still hadn't discussed long-term plans with me. The plan continued to move forward, but now it did so with small costs attached. Costs no one had budgeted for. I felt no triumph watching this. No satisfaction, just a quiet confirmation that my role had been larger than anyone had admitted, especially to themselves. And still I said nothing. Because consequences that arrive without commentary are harder to argue with. They don't feel like punishment. They feel like reality. By the time the panic surfaced, it didn't have a direction. It never does. It appeared as an urgency without clarity. Meetings are scheduled hastily, follow-ups stacked on follow-ups, a subtle tightening in people's voices, like they were trying to hold something together without quite knowing where it was coming apart. The HR meeting happened on a Tuesday. 30 minutes, neutral tone, carefully chosen language. Restructuring, shifting priorities, not performance-related. I listened without interruption. I nodded when appropriate. I asked 2 factual questions about timelines, about benefits. I didn't ask why. I already knew. What surprised me wasn't the content of the conversation. It was how unprepared they seemed for my composure. HR professionals are trained for emotion, for shock, for negotiation. Calm disrupts their script. "We didn't anticipate this would come as a surprise," the HR partner said gently. "It didn't," I replied. That was the moment the room changed. Afterward, the news moved quickly, faster than I expected. Managers were informed. A few colleagues reached out with confusion, sympathy, and poorly worded reassurance. "This doesn't make sense. They're making a mistake. You're the last person I thought this would happen to." I thanked them. I meant it. What no one said, what they couldn't say yet, was that the consequences had already begun to compound. Within days, small issues escalated. A partner questioned a decision that hadn't been fully contextualized. A deliverable slipped because assumptions weren't aligned. The new hire, now fully owning my former scope, grew visibly strained. He wasn't incompetent, he was underinformed. And that's when the calls started. Not from HR, from leadership. Clarifying questions, requests for context. Do you remember why this was structured this way? Can you remind us how this relationship was managed? I answered politely, briefly. During my notice period, I still acted in good faith, but I didn't resume my old role. I didn't step back into the invisible center. That version of me was no longer available. There was a meeting, unplanned, slightly tense, where someone finally said it. "We didn't realize how much you were holding." The statement landed softly, too soft to be useful. Realization, when it arrives after action, is informational, not corrective. They asked if there was anything they could do. The question wasn't formal, but it carried weight. It came from discomfort, not strategy. I paused before answering. "Nothing that wouldn't require changing the past," I said, calm, neutral, and that was the truth. You can't retrofit respect. You can't undo months of silent assumptions with a late acknowledgement. You can't ask someone to re-enter a role they've already exited internally. The panic intensified, not dramatically, but diffusely. Things worked, but not elegantly. People compensated, but inefficiently. The system adapted, but at a cost. Too late to fix it doesn't mean everything collapses. It means everything becomes more expensive. In time, in energy, in trust. As my last day approached, there were attempts at warmth, appreciation, retrospective praise. None of it was insincere. But sincerity isn't the same as timing. I received a farewell message from my manager. It thanked me for my contributions, for my professionalism, for my grace during transition. Grace is often praised when it makes others more comfortable. I accepted the praise without bitterness, without attachment, because by then I wasn't measuring the situation by how they felt about it. I was measuring it by how I felt about myself, and I felt intact. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It took place in a small conference room on my second to last day. No HR, no formal agenda, just my manager and me sitting across from each other with paper cups of coffee we didn't touch. He looked tired, not overwhelmed, thoughtful, like someone replaying choices they hadn't questioned at the time. "I want to understand," he said. "Was there something we missed?" The question was careful, not defensive, and for the first time it wasn't framed around logistics. It was human. I didn't rush to answer. "Yes," I said finally, "but it wasn't one thing." I explained, not chronologically, but structurally. I talked about how roles calcify when assumptions go unchallenged, how being dependable can slowly turn into being taken for granted, how silence, when interpreted as agreement, becomes a convenient substitute for consent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't recount every slight. I didn't accuse. I described patterns. He listened, really listened. That mattered, even if it changed nothing. "I wish you'd said something sooner," he said. "I was saying it," I replied, "just not in ways the system was trained to hear." That landed between us without friction. I told him about the planning document, not with anger, but with clarity, about how discovering it reframed months of interactions, how it made sense of decisions that had felt disjointed at the time. He didn't deny it. "That wasn't meant to be personal," he said. "I know," I replied, "but impact doesn't require intent." We sat with that. There was no apology. There didn't need to be. Apologies often try to close a loop that's already finished. What mattered was that I didn't feel the urge to convince him. I wasn't trying to be understood perfectly. I was speaking because it was accurate, not because I needed absolution. At the end, he asked a question that surprised me. "Would you consider coming back someday?" I thought about it, not theatrically, not emotionally. "No," I said, "but I appreciate you asking." That answer wasn't punitive. It was honest. The conversation ended with a handshake, a genuine one. No lingering tension, no unfinished business. Confrontation without heat doesn't seek to win. It seeks to leave nothing misrepresented. And when I walked out of that room, I didn't feel lighter. I felt complete. I used to think change would feel dramatic, like a sudden release, like clarity arriving all at once, washing everything clean. That's not how it happened. The real shift revealed itself slowly in how I moved through my days after I left. I didn't wake up triumphant. I woke up quietly. For the first few weeks, I did very little. I let my nervous system settle. I took walks in the middle of the day without checking the time. I noticed how often I had been bracing myself without realizing it, how tension had become background noise. When that noise faded, something else took its place: discernment. I saw, more clearly than before, how often I had equated usefulness with worth, how easily I'd accepted roles that required constant output but offered no authorship. That wasn't bitterness, it was understanding. I hadn't been wrong to value stability, I had just overextended it. Now, when I work, I choose contexts that recognize structure as intelligence, not just execution. I consult, I advise, I design systems, but I do it with explicit boundaries. The scope is named, influence is acknowledged, silence is optional, not assumed. People ask me how I handled it so well. The truth is, I didn't handle it. I integrated it. There's a difference. I didn't become louder. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't adopt a persona built from defiance or performative confidence. I stayed exactly who I was: observant, composed, principled. But I stopped confusing restraint with erasure. I also stopped waiting for organizations to notice what I carried. I name it now, calmly, early, not as a demand, but as an orientation. If the room can't hold that clarity, I don't contort myself to fit it. That's the real change. Not confidence as volume, confidence as alignment. I no longer mistake endurance for integrity. I no longer confuse patience with self-respect. I no longer assume that being indispensable protects you. It often does the opposite. Who I am now is not someone hardened by the experience. I'm someone clarified by it. I trust my timing. I trust my perception. I trust my ability to leave without burning and to stay without disappearing. That trust is quiet, and it's enough. There's a lesson people often try to extract from stories like this, and it usually sounds something like, speak up sooner, advocate for yourself more, don't let it happen again. Those aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. Because the deeper truth isn't about volume or timing, it's about awareness, about recognizing when a system is benefiting from your silence and calling that arrangement what it is, even if you never say it out loud. What happened to me wasn't extraordinary. That's the part that matters most. It was ordinary, familiar, built from reasonable decisions made by well-intentioned people who never stopped to ask who was absorbing the cost. This isn't a story about villains, it's a story about drift, about how roles slowly solidify, how useful can quietly replace recognition, how being easy to work with can become an unspoken expectation rather than a choice. And it's about the power of noticing that shift before it hollows you out. Quiet dominance doesn't come from outmaneuvering others. It comes from refusing to abandon yourself in order to maintain harmony, from choosing coherence over applause, from understanding that you don't need to expose a system to exit it with integrity. Sometimes the strongest move isn't confrontation, it's completion. I didn't win anything in the traditional sense. I didn't reverse the decision. I didn't receive a last-minute promotion or a dramatic apology. What I gained was something less visible and more durable. I left without confusion. I left without resentment. I left without needing them to understand me fully. That's not resignation. That's authorship. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself somewhere in the story, if you've been the reliable one, the quiet one, the person who holds things together while others move forward, I want you to know this. Your awareness matters more than your endurance. You don't have to explode to protect yourself. You don't have to disappear to keep the peace, and you don't owe silence to systems that profit from it. Sometimes the most powerful response is to move on cleanly, with your values intact and your clarity sharpened. Before we end, I want to leave you with a question, not to answer here, but to sit with. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped explaining yourself was the moment you finally understood what was happening? If that question resonates, I'd love to hear how. Thank you for listening.